These first two chapters make up a preliminary orientation, without which a rudimentary understanding of the formula outlined in this book would be impossible. The principal concepts of the cyclical and sevenfold nature of earthly existence, and our evolution within it, are unfortunately all but unknown except to those who have ventured to understand the occult substratum that makes up that existence. While the more general concept of cycles is easier to swallow and digest, because of the physical proof of the cyclical nature of our natural world, being easily apprehended by our senses, the cycle of life, the seasons, etc., the sevenfold or septenary nature of existence constitutes more of a hurdle to the modern mind. This is partially because of the specificity. Why the number 7 as opposed to other numbers? But also due to its simplicity. There is an understandable reluctance to believe that something as vast as existence could be reduced to a specific number. There is another mental hurdle to the comprehension not just of this particular principle, but to the entire thesis of this work that should be addressed before we continue. The readers themselves may not find these concepts believable. This is beside the point because what I am outlining is the belief of the controllers, or those who carried out this plan. You or I may not believe in racial supremacy. I personally do not. What matters is the fact that the tribe who has taken control of Western society most positively believes that they have been chosen by a metaphysical deity to take on the role of an existential slave master. This belief, and the extreme genocidal actions taken by the tribe as a consequence, are outlined over and over again in their holy books. This fact, obvious to anyone who has taken an unbiased look at their history, has not stopped the tribe from repeatedly accusing their enemies of this same racial supremacy. A continual tendency towards projection is characteristic of the neurotic nature of tribal psychosis, and what was articulated by prominent tribe member Saul Alinsky, quote, "Accuse your opponent of what you are doing." As concerns my personal belief in the concepts of the cyclical and septenary nature of manifestation, after 7 years of intense and objective study of these and numerous other occult or esoteric concepts, I can affirm that I have seen enough evidence to conclude that these two particular principles are at the very least a valid lens with which to interpret physical and metaphysical existence. The most common and reliable methods of validating any occult concept, indeed the most reliable method of navigation within the world of the occult, is through analogy and correspondence. While traversing this path, we will find ourselves repeatedly visiting the aforementioned, quote, holy books of the tribe, manuscripts in which the number 7 plays a much more prominent part than any of its numerical cohorts. In fact, this number plays an important role in almost all of the main metaphysical tomes throughout history and across the globe. Another important rule that should be remembered as we proceed is the neutral nature of all knowledge and the power that comes in the apprehension of it. These powers can be used with good or bad intention, an observable fact in the current morally complex age of artificial intelligence. Power in itself is neither good nor bad. It is the intention that lies behind the use of that power, selfish or selfless, that colors its effects. After this chapter, which hopefully gives a clear understanding of a concept necessary to the comprehension of the total work, we will be ready to start our journey on the descending cultural path that constitutes the years from 1945 to 1994. Although this sounds like a depressing and demoralizing trip, I assure you that besides the valuable insight it will give into yourself, your family, into humanity and how it came to its current condition, The proceeding chapters will be, for lack of a better word, fun. There will be the exposition of little tricks, hidden meanings and cultural memes that seemed inconsequential at the time. Undeniable synchronicities that went unnoticed but will seem obvious when revealed. These revelations are not given for the novelty, or to make myself look more genius than the next researcher. One of the aims of this work is to offer you thought processes and forms that will hopefully forge new channels for understanding the manipulated world around you and enable a more realistic interpretation of that environment. Ultimately, at the very least, I would like to help humans in general not to be such rubes, to change the sucker birth rate from 1 a minute to 1 every 2 minutes. Picture in your mind a 6-pointed or Star of David. Imagine the center of this star, or the hexagon, as the essence or emanating force from which the 6 triangles extend. A triangle is the first manifestation of form in a shape, and these triangles represent 6 individual forms of manifestation of this innate essence in the central hexagon. The Star of David is a symbol which in itself represents 2 triangles, one symbolizing matter and the other spirit, intersecting from above and below, creating man, or life, within the hexagon. This is the allegorical meaning of Moses' meeting with Jehovah on Mount Sinai. The mount represents man's material, physical, or lunar evolution. The word Sinai originating from the Sumerian deity of the sun, Sin, as opposed to the solar or spiritual. Rising to meet the descending word of spirit and receiving the 10 Commandments. This is man's role. Humanity is the living representation of the balance and conflict of spirit and matter, constantly recalibrating itself. Go one step further and consider the triangle itself. 2 lines representing spirit and substance, the 3rd line creating the primal form, which is born by the relationship of the 2, hence the Trinity, the Father, Mother, and Son of all theology. Now, shine a pure white beam of light through this prism, and we have the 7 colors of the rainbow, the arc, or the Norse rainbow bridge, between the invisible causal force and the world of kaleidoscopic substance. These are the 7 builders of the manifest, or Elohim, of the Zohar, the 7 Amshapens of Zoroaster, the 7 gods of Egypt, the Sapta Rishis of Brahmanism. The number 7 was the general symbol for all association with God, and was the favorite religious symbol of Judaism, typifying the covenant of holiness and sanctification, and also all that was holy and sanctifying in purpose. The agricultural cycle mandated by the Torah is 7 years, and there are 7 names of God in their system. The Kabbalah has its 10 Sephirot, the invisible and causal trinity symbolized by 777, making up the first 3, from which emanate the lower 7, or Sephiroth of construction. These builders of the physical world dispose themselves like the rungs of a ladder, descending from spirit and becoming darker and more material as they extend to our earth. The 7 primal builders manifest themselves initially in sound, or the word. The 7 basic tones, which in endless variations of harmony, create vibrations in primordial substance, in turn creating the multiple forms, visible and invisible, which surround us. To list the endless iterations and meanings of the number 7 within Judaism would literally take volumes to complete. What concerns us for the purposes of this work is the Jubilee Cycle, also called the Yobel. The word Jubilee, ironically, originates from the Aryan or Indo-European root word yu, meaning to shout, and refers to the blowing of the shofar or ram's horn on Yom Kippur, or the 7th month of the Jubilee year, which occurs every 49 years. The Jubilee cycle itself is made up of 7 seven-year periods, at the end of which all the land from which the Jews were exiled will be returned to them. Quote, "You shall count off 7 weeks of 7 years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. Then you shall have the trumpet sounded loud, on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. You shall have the trumpet sounded throughout all your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return, every one of you, to your property, and every one of you to your family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you." Unquote. These passages in Leviticus do not just refer to property. They also refer to the acquirement of slaves, alien to this land, which would be held in perpetuity. Quote, "As for the male and female slaves whom you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also acquire them from among the aliens residing with you, and from their families that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property. These you may treat as slaves, but as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness." Unquote. We can assume at this point in history that this land which they feel themselves entitled to, in fact which has been given to them by Jehovah, is not just referring to Israel. After all, they are the chosen of God, and we, quote, aliens, are to be their slaves. The numerous passages in the Old Testament referring to this doctrine of separation and supremacy attest to this firm belief. Now let us return to the concept of the septenary nature, a concept held not exclusively to Judaism, but common, it would appear, to all of our earliest theologies and belief systems spanning the globe. We see it applied not just to its manifestation in the physical universe and nature, but to the individual human as well. Almost all of these ancient systems contemplated human beings and our constitution in terms of a numbered division of descending principles. For the purposes of this work, I will be using what I believe to be the most thorough and responsible synthesis of these ancient manuscripts concerning the septenary nature of man, that of the original theosophical movement, within their literature produced in the last quarter of the 19th century. As in all occult or metaphysical systems, there is some minor disagreement as to order and division of these principles, and I implore you, as always, to do your own research. It was, however, with my own eyes, as it were, that I witnessed the uncanny way all these puzzle pieces fell into place, as I spent years attempting to untangle how this degeneration occurred. For example, I had never heard of the Jubilee Cycle until after I had come to this conclusion, that this formula had taken place over 7 seven-year periods. Not least of these fun facts was that the human body actually totally reconstitutes itself every 7 years. This meant that those born at the advent of this 49-year cycle would be going through mental, physical, and psychic changes in congruence with the artificial cultural changes detailed in this work. In that way, the manufactured genres could be modeled around and designed to mirror and manipulate these natural 7-year growth cycles. This technique created a cultural phenomena that had grown more and more apparent to me over the course of my own life. Those born during different 7-year periods of this process could have personalities vastly different than those born with even a few years difference between them. To elaborate, An individual born in 1974, or part of the 1973 to 1980 genre, might consider themselves, and indeed have, both subtle and great differences in conduct, tastes, slang usage, dress, etc., than one born in 1971, or part of the 1966 to 1973 genre. Discoveries like these kept on occurring until it got to the point that I felt I could present this hypothesis to the public without looking like I was trying to crap on the ceiling. In fact, I had to present this work to the public no matter the consequences. And if history is any guide, there will be consequences. The wisdom religion postulates that the farther you go back in history, the more purely spiritual humanity and their belief systems were. Again, we arrive at the idea of there being a tree of knowledge, whose trunk is a truth or wisdom religion, which was common to all humanity, and which over time grows and splits into multiple different manifestations. In fact, the story of the Tower of Babel is an allegory for a humanity who is of one word or, quote, lip, descending into a multiplicity of beliefs, languages, and nations. You could say that we are at the bottom of this descending arc at present, existing in a morass of atomized languages, nationalities, and beliefs. Multiplicity, atomization, and materialization are symptoms of this progressive descent over hundreds of thousands of years. Because of this belief, Theosophy uses the ancient Sanskrit tongue of the Aryans, root of so many of our modern languages. A fitting example will give you some idea of why this is important. The Greek myth of Prometheus tells of a demigod who brings the fire of knowledge to humanity. The word Prometheus comes to us from the Sanskrit word pramantha, meaning a rounded stick rubbed between the hands to produce fire through its friction with a wooden base. I could show you example after example, from the profound to the rudimentary, of the importance of Sanskrit and the Aryan basis for so much of what we take for granted, not only restricted to language. The similitude of the stories and etymology involved within the Krishna and Christ legends is only one, if not the most important. We will begin our diagram of these 7 descending principles of man from the top with the Sanskrit Atman, or what is called variously the Absolute, the Unborn and Undying, the Causal Cause, the Secondless, or most commonly the Supreme Spirit or Self. From there we will descend from vehicle to vehicle of that spirit, the word vehicle from Vahan, another Sanskrit word, until we arrive at that most material and gross of our physical manifestation, the body, or Sula Sarira. On the left, I will give the 7-year genres which correspond to these divisions. Number 7, or the top, Atman, the Supreme Spirit, corresponding to the years 1945 to 1952, the atomic or pop genre. Next, number 6, the Buddhi, the Logos or the Christos, corresponding to the genre 1952 to 1959. The Rock, otherwise known as the Sun, and Roll or Rock and Roll era. Number 5, Manas, or the Mind, which is a dual principle. This genre is split into 2 because it is dual. The first part, from 1952 to 1963, constitutes the folk era, or the higher mind. The next part, 1963 to 1966, corresponds to the British invasion, typified by the Beatles. The name the Beatles coming from the ancient word Beitil, meaning standing stone, and representing the higher, the Rolling Stones representing the lower, Number 4, or Kamarupa, the animal soul, corresponding to the years 1966 to 1973. The music of this era is called acid rock. Number 3, the Linga Sharira, or the astral body, corresponding to the years 1973 to 1980. The music of this era being heavy metal and punk. Number 2, the prana, life force, vitality, corresponding to the years 1980 to 1987. The music of this time being new wave. And number 1, the Sula Sarira, or physical body, the lowest of manifestation, the basest, corresponding to the years 1987 to 1994. It's a rap and grunge. As we progress through these periods of time, I will, in corresponding chapters, elaborate more on the aspects of each of these descending principles, and how their essence was artificially implemented through cultural manipulation. It will be apparent that it is not just music that reflects the overall theme of the dictating principle. Literature, cinema, television, and other creative aspects of culture will be used to influence the genre. The symptoms of this influence will show themselves in statistics relating to crime, literacy, fertility, and other indicators used to track the health of a society. For example, the aggressive, passionate, unrestrained satisfaction of base desires, indicative of the base nature of the Kamarupa, or animal soul, in the period from 1966 to 1973, bore itself out in the extreme statistical increase in violent and sexual crime, drug use, and the prison population. Riots, assassinations, an imbalance in the collective mentality of the population caused by drugs like LSD, all combined to create an atmosphere of chaos in which new aspects of the overarching agenda could be introduced. The popular attitude has always been that the creative and artistic culture of the time is a reflection of these environmental conditions. The eternal refrain from the transgressive artist or musician is that they are only expressing the reality on the, quote, streets. What I claim in this work is a reversal of this assertion, that it is the promotion of a manufactured culture in conjunction with the promotion and distribution of appropriate drugs that creates the environment on those streets. These dire conditions are in turn used to justify concrete measures in government, academia, and the judiciary that further the aim of enslavement. The drugs, the unrestrained hedonism, the bread and circus atmosphere of sports and entertainment also create a fog that blinds the population to their worsening condition. This reversal of the concept of cultural influence, that it is indeed the culture which creates the community, is one that is de facto rejected by the masses. Your average citizen believes that fame comes with merit. Even in the world of politics, one undeniably in the grip of the financier, the public retains a Mr. Smith goes to Washington idea of how his world operates. A random citizen makes a name for themselves as a person of honor and impeccable ethics, and is subsequently elected to office in a transparent and above-board process. Unless, of course, this politician is of the opposing party, the party structure being yet another binary illusion, which never makes any difference in policy. In reality, the makeup of the worlds of media, entertainment, and all levels of politics are molded according to an overarching narrative with one aim in mind: control. Over the 50 years covered here, we see the same tribe families rear their heads over and over again, the same names working tirelessly in their delegated section of the agenda. They remain unknown to the bulk of the population, whose lives are nonetheless irreversibly altered over the decades by their actions. Families like the Sacklers, who first introduced the devastating drug Valium in the 1950s, and the infinitely worse OxyContin in the 1990s. The Flexner family, who is all but unknown despite single-handedly creating our current deadly and corrupt medical industry. The vampiric banking dynasties like the Lehmans and Goldmans, attached like lampreys to our dying countries. These are only a few examples, and it would be pointless for me to waste time going over ground that has been covered copiously by other researchers more qualified than myself. If you have your doubts about the identity and profusion of this group and the bottlenecks of power and cultural influence, ask yourself this. If it was discovered that all the major cable news networks, most of the owners and editors of newspapers, all your major film studios, music producers, major publishing houses, school boards, faculty and administration of universities from the Ivy League to the local college, major banking houses, and Wall Street in general, the medical and pharmaceutical industry, including your local doctors and dentists, the majority of the judiciary and legal profession from federal to local, the social media and tech giants, major donors to the main political parties, were all overwhelmingly made up of Mormons, what would the reaction be? Surely there would be some kind of popular uproar, and it would be agreed that there would be undue influence on our society by this group. Would you be accused of anti-Mormonism for bringing this to light? Probably not. But Mormons make up about the same percentage of the U.S. as the Judaic tribe. Again, the power exercised by this group is so obvious, if you are willingly blind to the phenomena, there is not much chance you will be able to grasp the thesis of this work. That being understood, I will carry on as if the debate is moot. These 7 divisions have numerous corollaries, some of which include the 7 days of the week, the planets which correspond to those 7 days, and the characteristics which have been assigned to those planets over millennia. Therefore, by designating the day Sunday and the celestial body of the sun to the first genre, Monday and the moon to the succeeding genre of 1952 to 1959, etc., we can recognize the analogous symbols in the popular culture of the time. Some of these corollaries are novel and particular. Tribe member Alan Freed, co-creator of the term rock and roll, with record store owner and fellow tribe member Leo Mintz, using the moniker Moondog while promoting this new form of popular music during the 1952 to 1959 time period. Others are more general. Sunday, or the Day of Rest, denoting the 7 years after the Second World War, a time period when tribal control was solidified in government, academia, philanthropic foundations, and the judiciary. The foundation laid over these 7 years would serve as the bedrock upon which the succeeding 6 genres could be built. Although there was firm opposition to this institutional takeover, a movement co-opted under the name of anti-communism, these cultural changes would ultimately be achieved under the noses of a population busy recuperating, or, quote, resting, from the severe trauma of warfare. From a more novel standpoint, the atom bomb symbolized an artificial sun, or symbol of the Big Bang, or genesis of this fabricated agenda. Innocuous-sounding song lyrics like Goodbye Ruby Tuesday take on new meaning when we note the year it was released. 1966 marked the end of the 7-year genre assigned to Tuesday. When you change with every new day, indeed. I am fully aware that this sounds like the breakthrough discovery of the toothless man with his pants on backwards, who inhabits your local refrigerator box. Believe me, I mulled this idea over for years before I felt there was enough circumstantial evidence, or semblance of validity to my claim, that it would be at the least provide some entertainment to those who could not bring themselves to believe my thesis. These and numerous other correspondences will be detailed for each of the 7-year time periods and will, I believe, bring the reader to the same point this writer arrived at, where what seemed to be the province of paranoid schizophrenia on its face became a thesis at least justified of further exploration under the weight of countless coincidences. Other red flags had to do with major events and how they fit like time markers punctuating the schedule of the agenda. One of the standout events on this schedule is what has been termed the, quote, Day the Music Died by Don McLean in his iconic and very relevant to this work song, American Pie. This refers to the February 3, 1959 plane crash, which took the lives of Ritchie Valens, the Big Bopper, and most importantly, Buddy Holly, an event which put a punctuation mark on the end of the rock and roll era, which ends on our timeline in 1959. A trinity of deaths of the most iconic representatives of a musical genre, marking or facilitating the end of that genre, is a phenomena that would repeat itself, although not as time-specifically, with the deaths of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison, putting an end to acid rock. Additionally, the deaths of Jim Croce and Harry Chapin, and the conversion of Cat Stevens to Islam, would see the end of the singer-songwriter genre. These cultural markers are not exclusively due to deaths. The electrified performance of Maggie's Farm at the Newport Festival in July of 1965 by Bob Dylan is an example. The mostly shocked and offended audience of fans, expecting the more wholesome and, quote, high-minded acoustic folk music they expected from their hero, were witnessing what was, if not a fatal wound, at least a repudiation of the compassion and selflessness that had characterized folk music until then. Major music festivals were one of the most effective tools of cultural change, Woodstock and Altamont being the most well-known and characterizing the polar nature of the counterculture of the late 60s. The more massive of these festivals are always organized by tribe members, and usually have the cooperation, open and hidden, of the military. I will be elaborating on all these events and more as we arrive at the appropriate genre. As we descend through this 50-year agenda, there is a noticeable splitting or atomizing of different musical styles. What started out as a monolithic phenomena called rock and roll, by the 1970s had become an octopus with multiple tentacles like heavy metal, punk rock, glam, and disco. The very name acid rock indicates a breakdown or dissolution of rock. All of these musical genres would further split apart into numerous subgenres with their own language, attitude, and style of dress in the 1980s. Again, we see the mimicking of the Tower of Babel scenario, where the monolith, or rock, degenerates and atomizes, until it becomes in the end one homogeneous soup of chaos, onto which the template of enslavement can be pressed upon an exhausted and confused populace. For this reason, by the end of the 1960s, we see that while a 7-year period could be assigned to an aspect of the agenda of degeneration, it could not be designated to one particular genre of music. Another reason for these multiple musical forms was that there were new populations that had to be corralled, according to their particular experience under and reaction to the agenda. Punk rock and heavy metal, each one corresponding to either the urban or rural youth of Generation X, were specifically designed to funnel the natural and justified rebellion of a portion of this age group against the agenda, which was becoming more obvious every year, into directionless nihilism and self-destruction. This tactic had been used successfully 10 years before against the activist portion of the baby boomer generation, with certain bands like the Grateful Dead diverting street activism into incoherent, drug-fueled hedonism. The technique was tremendously effective, and the casualties and deaths facilitated by this portion of the project are still piling up to this day. I have personally witnessed this carnage and the effect it had on many who were close to me. Those who did not die from overdose, suicide, or other deaths of despair were diverted into blind alleys and garden paths of the binary, utopian, and simple-minded political movements, designed for and left over from their baby boomer parents. They spend their lives in reaction to whatever narrative is provided for them by the same old tribe, professing compassion, but in reality desperate to fill the hole dug in their soul by the rejection of true spirituality and its replacement by an empty and indefensible atheism. They had no rock or anchor in the eternal, in the real. Their religion was one dedicated to an artificial, man-made, and destructible rock, one existing in the temporal world of the sensual, one which was in full control of the tribe. Although there were definite timely punctuations to the agenda, these genres would also overlap with each other. As there would be specific drugs prescribed each 7-year period, these drugs would begin their appearance during the preceding period, and with assigned characters as their promoters. These characters would have individual roles, like Ken Kesey and Timothy Leary in the case of LSD, but would also see their vanguard in manufactured groups, like the beatniks and their association with marijuana. As the agenda progressed, these drugs would become harder and more soul-destroying, along with the lifestyles embodied by their promoters. It was not just the increasing potency of the drugs that would change. It was the actual psychic effect of the individual drug, which would be prescribed to help bring about the specific cultural change desired for that time period. Psychedelic drugs like LSD were used to bring about an imbalance and expansion of the mind. This sudden and unguided psychic dilation would make the mind more amenable to artificial influences, which were inseminated using varying media, but mostly through music. This imbalance and the consequent, quote, blind grasping for stability, which was mentioned in the introduction, was also promulgated through television programs like The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits, which tore away at the scaffolding of sanity and stability my grandparents' generation had toiled so hard to erect after the trauma and chaos of the Second World War. Many of these programs were literal depictions of the delusions of paranoid schizophrenia, and their combination with psychedelic drugs and music surely drove many to the point of mental oblivion. This confrontation with extreme psychic desolation would leave many groping for any kind of spiritual reassurance, and there was no lack of mystical charlatans waiting for them with manifold love-bombing mind control cults. Another example of genre-specific drug prescription was the massive influx of soul-eviscerating drug cocaine during the 1980s, which combined with a culture of extreme shallowness and material obsession would be the death knell for any kind of spiritual advance that had taken place during the 1970s. The spiritual precipitation which occurred during the 1970s, and how it was anticipated, dealt with, and then extinguished, forms a kind of mid-process subplot which haunts the West, mostly subconsciously, to this day. I would venture to say that there has never been a time period more pined after, especially by Generation X. For some it forms a bleeding wound we have learned to keep craftily hidden, but which continues to bleed with the memory of intact families, intact communities, and the semblance of collective trust. It will haunt this work as well, for there is much to learn from what was a major obstacle to the tribe's intentions.